Chapter 23. Aspect of Strength. The prince felt as though he were floating. He was lighter than air, and he was perched up high somewhere, his body pillowed by soft, fluffy, billowing white clouds. He wasn't thinking about much of anything, just existing. Vague impressions came to him, here and there, something about the sunlight, something about the smell of pine trees, and something about a pair of fiery green eyes. He liked the thought of those eyes, but at the same time it all seemed rather unimportant, and so he floated on. He came across a cloud that smelled like travel dust and lavender soap, and then a little while later a cloud that was black and stormy-looking. That cloud was pouting, over in the corner all alone, trying to look dignified, but succeeding only in looking, well, foolish. Another cloud, slowly fading away, was revealing the sky behind it, a cloud that looked as if it had been a storm cloud once, but now appeared rather harmless. And then it was as if a bubble had been popped, and he was falling. Down through the clouds, down through the sky, toward a vast plain of swaying grass, and a wolf was howling in the distance, accompanied by a lion's roar. An eagle screeched as it descended next to him and caught a small animal far below, a golden, furry thing whose luck had run out. He fell and fell, down through the sky, and then as the grass grew closer, he saw a small bed, far, far below, but growing so quickly, with the sound of air rushing past his head, the wind pounding in his ears, the animals screaming with one voice. Light, and softer sounds. Voices. But how did he do it? I'm not sure. One minute I'm telling him to kill me, the next minute I'm jumping up, the sun's rising, and there's the shadow-cursed Prince of Ravens lying next to me with a Valyrian blade, looking like he'd been rolled through a briar patch, clubbed, and set on fire. The prince opened his eyes. He was wearing a long white shirt, sitting in a small hospital cot, and every other part of him seemed to be wrapped in bandages. His eyes began to drag closed again. He was very sleepy. I felt myself die, rumbled a voice, like boulders running down a hill. That's impossible, Tomaz, the girl responded. Tomaz? The prince's eyes flew open and focused on the giant, and then he did a kind of twitching jump as he realized that there was a dead man standing beside his bed. Whoa, calm yourself, princeling, the big man said, shock turning to laughter. Nice of you to come back to us. How are you? You're dead! The prince wasn't certain what was happening. His memories were all confused, his brain overworked, sore, and uncooperative. But I killed you! And brought him back, a voice said from the door, which I, at least, find much more interesting. Leah and Tomaz both started and looked around as Elder Crane entered the rather small infirmary room. The elder was wearing a simple gray-green cloak with a soft brown tunic and loose pants tied to the waist. Something hung around his neck, but the elder tucked this inside his shirt when he saw the prince looking at it. Crane came forward slowly, using a long wooden cane to steady himself. Elder, Tomaz and Leah said, respectfully bowing their heads. He nodded back, and then a smile brightened his face. The prince felt as though the room had just grown lighter. I'm sorry to interrupt your recovery, Crane said, but I wish to be the first to thank you, on behalf of the kindred, for what you did last night. Elder Carey notified me when she thought you were about to wake. I've often said she's nigh on clairvoyant. I expected to wait for a while, but it appears I arrived at precisely the right moment. The prince stared at him blankly, trying and failing to get his mind into some semblance of working order. Thank me? He finally managed to ask. His tongue felt too large for his mouth. Why is that necessary? I promised I would help, and I did not do it for you. He realized as the words came out that they sounded rude, and he tried to speak again, but the elder motioned him to silence, smiling as he did so. Please, there is no need for apologies, Crane said. I understand what you are trying to say. You did not help the kindred out of loyalty, and you did not do it out of belief in our cause. I understand this, and I know that your reasons are your own, but the kindred do owe you thanks. You had the chance to betray us, a chance to end the exiled kindred forever, and you did not. You turned against your society, your nation, and even your family in order to do what you thought was right. And for whatever other reasons you might have had, I think that you did it out of duty to the realm, and out of an understanding of the worthiness of life. These are qualities that are found in true leaders, those men and women who are not merely rulers or princes, but leaders. And it is for that reason that I, and the kindred, thank you. The prince opened his mouth to respond, but he wasn't quite sure what he could say to such a statement. His body ached, and he again began to question if this was all a dream. As to what I overheard when I was entering, Crane continued, I believe I might be able to shed some light on how Thomas came to be here. Do not worry, he continued, as the prince recoiled slightly. He is very much alive and kicking, as the expression goes. How? The prince asked. His throat felt sore, and his voice came out low and gravelly as he continued. Is it real, or have I gone mad? Well, I think you might be a better judge of that than I, Crane responded. I gather that you have the ability to sense life in others. A great gift indeed. Can you sense life in Thomas? The prince looked at the big man, taking in his appearance. He looked the same, that much was certain. The prince squinted, and the man stayed where he was. Thomas reached out a hand and briefly squeezed the prince's shoulder. Go on, he said. I promise I'll still be here when you open your eyes. The prince, still unsure, took a deep breath and let his eyelids flutter closed. He reached through the raven talisman, searching, and there the giant was. To his surprise, Thomas did feel like Thomas, and more. Somehow, much more. The prince couldn't understand it, but it felt like something out of his childhood. No, that couldn't be. His mind was still hazy and he was confused. But what was important was that the elder was telling the truth. The man was alive, and he was certainly Thomas. But how? He repeated, opening his eyes. What you call the raven talisman is known to the kindred as the aspect of life, Crane said. It is my belief that when you refused to accept the death of your friend, you forced the life you had absorbed from him back into his body. The prince stared at him, blankly, for a long moment. When you absorb a person's life, the elder said, they live on in you, yes? Correct me if I am wrong, for all I know comes second-hand, and you bear the burden of the talisman each day. But when you take a life, does not that life become a part of you? If so, it may be that under the right circumstances you can bring that life back as well. When you took his life, Thomas was a part of you for a little under an hour. He was still alive, in a sense, and you carried the strength and the power of enough men to force those memories and that strength back into him. But why couldn't he do it before? Leah asked. He's killed men before, and I've never seen him do anything like that. Have you done anything like that? I believe the answer lies there, Crane said, motioning to the sword that had been laid in its sheath on a table by the prince's bed, on top of a neatly folded pile of his clothing. Well, look more closely, Crane said. Leah leaned in, brow furrowed in concentration. A change slowly came over her, and she gave an uncharacteristically large gasp of surprise and turned to stare at the prince, one hand holding the pit of her stomach. The prince looked at her dumbly, his head still feeling like it was full of cotton. To his surprise, she crossed to his bedside, grabbed a handful of his hair, and pulled his face close enough to hers that they were almost nose to nose. How did you get it? She asked. It's the sword I got back in Vale, he spluttered, trying to understand what had caused such a reaction. She released his head and jabbed a finger at the sword. That is Aemon's blade. It's not just a sword, it's the sword, the first Valyrium blade. The prince's first thought was that she was making a joke. She had picked an odd time to do it, but yes, certainly a joke. Aemon's blade would be somehow special. This was just a plain sword. Yes, it was clearly made of the white metal Valyrium, but it had a simple handle wrapped in copper wire to prevent slippage, a strong but simple crossguard, and a plain oval pommel to counter the weight of the long, curved blade. It was just a sword. "That's not true. Why would you say such a thing?" he asked. He could only stare, dumbfounded, at her and the blade. "I heard a few soldiers talking about the battle between him and the Prince of Oxen," Tomas said slowly, scratching his bearded chin thoughtfully. "It seems that at one point he was thrown into the temple of Aemon. The Prince of Oxen followed him and brought the entire place down. There's hardly a column left standing. One of the only things they found in the rubble was a plain Valyrium blade." "I lost my sword," the prince said thickly, "but I found it again." "It wasn't your sword," said Elder Crane, hands folded behind his back, a strange look on his face. "It was Aemon's." "But how was I even able to touch it? Leah and Tomas told me the story. The sword was buried where Aemon died because no one could touch it. No one could move it." Crane looked at him for a long moment before glancing at both Tomas and Leah and then returning his gaze to the prince. "I will now tell you something that I must ask you not to repeat outside this room. It is information that is known only to the Council of Elders and perhaps a handful of others. I would ask Eshendai Goldwyn and Ashandal Banier to leave, but what I have to say concerns them too." The elder took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "However, it concerns, primarily, your father." Fire shot through the prince's body, gathering in his fingers and toes and lifting the hair on his arms and neck. His vision narrowed in on the elder to the exclusion of all else. The fuzzy feeling in his head was replaced with the sharp, cold sense of a well-honed razor. "My father." The elder nodded. 20 years ago, your father was sent on a mission to the Empire." "A mission?" "Yes, he and his Ashandel partner were rogue scouts." My father, he was an exile." Crane nodded. "One of our most skilled spellblades, in fact, born here to exiled parents. His father died before he was born, and his mother, your grandmother, died in childbirth. He was raised by all of the kindred, as our orphans are. He was everyone's son, everyone's brother. He was the last of his line, and he was treated with respect because he showed such promise. It was thought that he died on his mission to Lucien. The last report we had from him and his Ashandel said that they were infiltrating the fortress itself. He no doubt sent it when he did, knowing we wouldn't be able to stop him. He was smart and headstrong, and in the years since I have often thought that we should have waited to send him out, but his Ashandel was older than he, as was customary, and it was thought that the two of them were so well paired that this would be our first chance to see the inner workings of the Imperial Fortress with your father's skill and his Ashandel's experience. Their message was the last we heard of them. What we have learned since is that your father infiltrated the Most High and was brought into an audience with the Empress herself, where, it is rumored, he fell in love. He became the Empress's consort, though we cannot be certain whether it was for true love or in an audacious attempt to gain information. I must be honest with you about that. In any case, once you were born and found to be a viable child of the Empress, the tyrant had your father killed. It is a perverse sign of the respect she had for him that he was killed by a blade master, not by the Death Watchman. He was thought too dangerous for anyone else to deal with." The prince had to work moisture back into his throat before speaking. "How do you know all of this?" he asked. The elder turned to Tomas and raised an eyebrow. The big man, face white and eyes wide, nodded the barest fraction, and the elder continued. "This information came to us when Tomas joined the kindred." The prince looked up at the giant, whose face was now a mask of grief and pain, as well as unquestionable shame. "What does he mean?" the prince asked Tomas. The big man took a deep breath, his brows drawn and his mouth turned down at the edges. His black eyes bore a deep sorrow, making him look suddenly much older than his years. "I told you I was asked to commit an act that led me to betray the Empire." The prince nodded, numbly. "That act was to kill the Empress's consort and his traveling partner. To kill your father and his Ashendel." His eyes locked onto the prince's, wordlessly asking for forgiveness and understanding, but not expecting it. It was clear that no matter what pardon the prince could try to give, Thomas had already judged himself. "That's why you wouldn't let me leave in the mountains," the prince said softly. "That's why you came back for me in the Seeker's dungeon. And that's why you took the blow from Mamael's axe that should have killed me. You thought you were in my debt." Thomas nodded. He cleared his throat gruffly and shifted his weight, putting his hands on his hips. The prince realized that the big man was close to tears. "I can never bring your father back," Thomas said, his voice heavy with years of regret. "But when I found you in those mountains, I made it my duty to protect you. I couldn't save your father, but I could save you, even if it meant saving you from yourself." There was a long moment wherein no one spoke. The prince's mind was blank. Fatigue and shock had addled him. "What does any of this have to do with the sword?" Leah asked. Elder Crane nodded and continued, as if he'd been waiting all along for someone to prompt him. "The sword was the first Valyrian weapon forged, but also the first sword enchanted as a spellblade's weapon. Being a Valyrian weapon, the link forged was much more powerful than anticipated, and when Aemon died, we found that none could touch the blade. Aemon had a power in his blood, the seed of the same power that the Empress has. They brought it with them from across the sea, and when they settled here, that power began to dim. The Empress found a way to sustain that power and to grow it, but Aemon fled before he could learn from her, and his power died out, though some trace of it remained in his blood. When he came here and found Valyrium and used his blood to bind it to him, that dormant seed grew and blossomed, allowing him to fight and defeat the tyrant when she invaded. That seed was, we believe, passed down from him to his son, from that son to his daughter, and so on and so forth until your father." Leah and Thomas both looked as though they'd been punched in the gut. The elder fell silent and looked at them all, giving them time to absorb this new information. "But the line died with Aemon," Thomas said. "Aemon had no children." "He did have children, but they were kept secret," Crane responded calmly. "The Empress had invaded to kill Aemon, and with that accomplished, she retreated. It was imperative to keep Aemon's continued line from her knowledge, which was part of why Aemon could not let the Empress take him alive. It is why he fought to the death, to the last, on the spot we now call Aemon's Stand." "His father was the last of Aemon's line?" Leah asked. No, Crane said. "No, he is the last of Aemon's line." Thomas and Leah slowly looked at the prince. "No other of Aemon's line has been able to touch the sword, though we have tried again and again, obviously without telling them why. You, Raven, are the first to know of your heritage, in fact. But it is my belief that because you are also the son of the Empress, you have the same seed of power in your blood that Aemon had, allowing you to handle a sword originally paired exclusively to him and to his power of healing. For you see, healing, that was the secret he stole from the Empress, the ability to bring a person back from the edge of death as long as there is the smallest bit of life in them. To this day, she does not have that power, for she did not deem it worth having, and so she gave it to Aemon while she kept the other aspects, what you call talismans, and gave them to her children to help her rule. And you, with all of Thomas's memories conveniently stored away in your mind by the Raven Talisman, had more than enough to work with in order to bring him back. For, you see, Aemon's blood is in that blade, and I suspect that his sacrifice turned it into a talisman of its own in a way, allowing you to turn the Raven Talisman from its black, corrupted purpose back to what it was meant to be, the aspect of life. Even still, the task was enormous, and in your exhausted state I do not think you would have been able to manage it without the strength you had gained from Ramael, some of which was passed into Thomas. A quick look was exchanged between the two rogues, but the prince took little notice of it, for he was still staring at the elder. I know that this is a lot to take in, particularly after what has just happened. I will leave you alone, though once you feel adjusted enough to be up and walking, I would like to speak with you further. There is the matter of the information you gave us on the castle of Rourke. The information you gleaned from your brother's memories. Part of it is incomplete, and we would very much appreciate your help in filling in the blanks. But, more than that, I will make no secret of the fact that you are the hero of this battle. The kindred know your story. They know now your identity as the Prince of Ravens, and also, some of them now too know you to be Aemon's heir. You gave me and the elders your loyalty until this crisis had passed, and passed it has. Now, you are free to choose, and I would like very much to know where that decision will take you, where it will take us all. And then, with a respectful nod of his head, Crane turned and made for the door, motioning for Leah and Thomas to follow him and to leave the prince alone. Wait! The elder stopped and turned back. I have 2 questions, the prince said. The elder nodded and waited. First, if I decide to leave, will you let me? Yes, the elder said immediately. The prince felt a huge weight fall off of him that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The elder continued. The kindred are in your debt for our very existence. You are not our prisoner. The council has unanimously decided that should you wish to leave, it is only right of us to let you. Though please know that you will always have a place here with us. You need not continue to run. The prince, overwhelmed, could do nothing but nod. I believe you had a second question, the elder prodded. Yes. What was my father's name? The elder's face took on a look of surprise, and then he smiled slightly. Relkin, he said. It is one of the oldest names we have. It means true son. Your father chose it on his name day when he turned 18. He chose it because he saw himself as the son of all the kindred who had brought him up. Relkin, the prince said, seeing how the name sounded. Thank you. The elder nodded and turned again to leave. Thomas and Leah, however, did not. I think we should speak with him alone, elder, Thomas said, about the matter we discussed before. I think he needs to know it all. Crane looked like he might protest, but then he said, It is your gift. You have the right to share it with whom you wish. And with that, he finally left, closing the door quietly behind him. Thomas and Leah turned to the prince. Leah, he began before they could speak, thank you for helping me. Not necessary, she said, giving him one of her rare smiles. It is, the prince insisted. You seem to be making a habit out of saving my life. You saved mine, too, she said. I'm still grateful, he responded. She rolled her eyes. You princes and your manners, she mocked. But then she grew quiet, and even looked troubled. She glanced at Thomas, and the prince looked to the giant as well. Thomas, thank you for what you did, what you were willing to do, sacrificing your life the way you did to save the kindred, to save me. Thomas nodded, face drawn and still tight with emotion. The prince cleared his throat, which had a sudden lump in it. Thank you, Thomas said, for bringing me back. There was a long pause, in which Leah and Thomas looked at each other once more. The prince looked between them both, frowning. What is it? They both looked at him, and then Leah cleared her throat. When you brought Thomas back, you gave him something. The prince looked from the girl to the giant, confused about what she was saying, trying to see if this was a joke. I don't understand, he said, trying to be polite. Leah opened her mouth again to speak, but then closed it and turned to Thomas. He quirked an eyebrow at her, and she shrugged in response. "Well, I think I'll just show you," Tamaz rumbled. He began to undo the lacings on his simple cotton tunic. "What are you doing, Tamaz?" the prince asked, very confused. "Just wait," Leah said, looking at him anxiously, and the prince realized that they were both frightened of how he would react to what they were about to show him. His mind began to race through all the possibilities as Tamaz undid the lacings on his high-necked cotton shirt. Had the prince somehow left him so badly scarred it would affect his life? Was there a gaping hole in his side, a permanent wound that would not close? What could frighten them this badly? The giant pulled the shirt over his head, and the prince's mouth dropped open. Tamaz's chest was covered with dimly glowing red lines that seemed to pulse and twist as he moved. They outlined the muscles of his chest, his shoulders, his arms, and his stomach. They moved up the sides of his neck and stopped just short of his chin, and now the prince understood the purpose of the shirt's high-necked collar. Tamaz turned slowly, and the prince saw that the markings, like carefully banked coals ready to burst into flame, continued on his back as well, lining every muscle. "How is that possible?" the prince asked. "I killed him. It should have gone back to the Empress." "We think you absorbed it along with the Oxlord's life," Leah said, speaking slowly and watching him closely. "And when you brought back Tamaz, you passed it to him along with his memories." Tamaz turned back to face the prince, who found himself speechless. The Ox talisman, for its part, continued to pulse with a fiery red light, beating in time with the giant's heart.